Whenever you hear the word research, it just sounds like something so distant. And you think of a laboratory, people in laboratory coats, and you may think of computation of numbers, and it is part of all of that, but it is so much more about how you approach an understanding of what is like social phenomenon. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the social research process and what it entails, the difference between qualitative and quantitative research, and just give you kind of an overview because it is so important to really understand where all this theoretical and concept development comes from, and it comes from research. So if you were to look at the back of your textbook, for example, and see the list of references, it's so many, right? This is all each of these individuals and probably a team undertook research. Sometimes it takes months, mostly takes years, but to develop these ideas. So it's really higher level thinking. I wouldn't get caught up so much on the methods and the tools because you learn those along the way. But what it is, it's really a mindset. And it starts with a question or a problem. Why does this occur? Why is this happening? Usually we see things happening and then we wonder why, right? So it's the first is kind of observing something that's happening, or we've observed it over and over again and we want to figure out why. Like I always wonder why some people are very late. And is there a social acceptability around being late? And how late is late? When is it not socially acceptable? Are there regional differences in what's acceptable in lateness? Are there differences between societies and nations and their social acceptability? So you could go on and on with the questions, right? The next thing is to kind of see what's already been done. You may find that someone has already found an answer for you. And so when you're writing a research paper or a report or whatever you call it, when you go out and you find information that's already been written, and I'll talk a little bit about that, that's secondary data. Someone else has done it. So but let's say it hasn't been done. Then you're going to formulate a hypothesis after you've kind of read the research and what is missing, what has not been detailed in the research. You're trying to find where a gap in the research is. So in the example that I use with being late, there may be a gap in the literature that no one's ever done a cross-generational examination of the social acceptability of lateness. Do people who are older have greater expectations around being on time? Is it a generational variation? So let's say that's what it was. That's my hypothesis, is there is a cross-generational variation in the social acceptability of lateness. Then I've got to test the hypothesis. This is where the research actually happens. How do I figure out what's happening? Do I use a survey? If I use a survey, of course, I want to ask people's age. But then I also want to come up with questions about what they think about lateness. So that's the hard part, is creating that instrument and creating those questions and then pulling the data, of course, and then analyzing the data. And then we draw the conclusions and report the findings. That's what academic journals are about. Here's what I found in the research. And then from that research, people have a different understanding that they did before, and they may doing research, and that is going to lend, help to their, it's called a literature review, is everything that's already been written. And this idea, and it's coming in my mind, is the spherical foundation of research. And this person found this, and you added to this what they said, and added to this. So it's not a loop; it's it's like a spherical process. So let's talk a little bit about what we're really trying to get to. We're really trying to get to the truth. Now, I see truth in two ways. I see truth as having a capital T, indicating everything, all that is, and then truth with a small t is what we accept as truth. Now, we have secondary data and primary data. If I was trying to get to the truth, I may start with secondary data, which is what someone else has done. It didn't come from my mind. It came from someone else's. They put in the work. So when someone says they're doing research, you're really not doing research. You're just gathering information. It's information gathering, what someone else did. The research is when you come up with the idea, you come up with the research instrument, you use the research instrument, you collect the data, you analyze the data, and you formulate the conclusions, just like we said in the last slide. But the primary data is when you actually collect that, and that is closer to the truth than secondary data. So secondary data is like what someone else says, and primary data is let me go see for myself, what's happening out there, the social phenomenon. Now, there are really two basic types of research data that's collected, qualitative and quantitative. Qualitative is really when you ask more description. It's usually done through interviews. It could be done through open-ended questions, but you allow the participant in the research to give you whatever answer they want to based on maybe the questions and the prompts that you give them. Each person has a different point of view based upon their entire experience of life up to that point. It's just almost amazing that we can even have any commonality with people because we have so many varied experiences and the perception and the interpretation of our experiences. On the other side, we have quantitative data, which is numbers and that kind of measurement. So we use quantitative data a lot when we see statistics of percentages and graph charts and pie charts. We're saying that if there are more numbers in a particular area, it's leaning towards closer to the truth, which is interesting because I know you probably have seen Family Feud. Family Feud is not based on hard research. They survey 100 people, right? And then you're basically coming up with answers that you think those 100 people were most likely to say. It's a small number, 100, to represent millions, but there's also this idea that there's a general aspect of commonality, but then as we get deeper into the complex questions, then you're going to see more variance. Sometimes you can take qualitative data and turn it into quantitative data. For example, if you interviewed someone and they used certain descriptive words repeatedly, frequency of a particular word, that may lend itself to the study. So if someone used tardy or late or punctuality, or then things like to describe what that means, disrespect or insubordinates may come up in lateness over and over. So those are negative words that have kind of a negative feel for that person, is not looked on. That's like the opposite of social acceptability based upon that idea that I posed with being, the idea of studying a lateness. How do we measure things quantitatively? There's 4 scales. There's a nominal, ordinal, interval, and ratio. So sometimes the scales, for example, one object is different from another. It doesn't mean that they're completely directly comparable and so forth. And sometimes there is a scale where there's a ratio. So when I think about measurement scales, most of us know what a weight scale is that we step on and measure our weight. So those scales, that's kind of a part of a measurement as well. What does that mean? It means actual pounds. But if you had a scale that measured happiness, maybe a 10-point scale, what is happiness to you may not be the same to me. So I'm interpreting your scale, but not given the opportunity to kind of share what that means to me. So research is actually, if you think about the research design and creating the research instruments, that's really an interesting part of the process. It is lengthy. It takes a long time to get to the conclusions, which is what we want to know, the conclusions and the findings. But it's definitely something that is so important to any scientific field. So I wanted you to really understand the basics of research, because sometimes we go through so quickly that we don't really fully understand the nature of that and how it is informing all these theories and concepts of which you are learning about.